and he lived down in Alton, Illinois, which is north of St. Louis. And so in later, after, I guess when he was still in high school, he got a lucrative offer from Ringling Brothers and Byron Bailey Circus to come and be something to see at the circus. And it was a lot of money, so he agreed to do it. And so he would travel around with the circus and just stand there with his suit on and greet people and give autographs, and very nice, intelligent young man. And but he was this huge size. And so apparently, as near as John Gustafson could determine, about 1938, the circus came someplace in the Chicagoland area. And he got himself some kind of a car that you'd have to take some of the seats out of the car so he could get into it. But he wanted to come to Batavia because this guy wanted to be a minister. And he was studying the architecture of churches. And he was told that in Batavia, Illinois, there was this church, the United Methodist, down the street that had this very unique architecture to it. And so he wanted to come out and visit this church. So he was able to rent a car, but the car says to him, well, we'll take you out there, but we can't stay around for the couple hours you're probably going to want to hang around. We'll have to try to get back to you by a certain time and whatever have you. So he thought about trying to take the streetcar, but the streetcar said they couldn't take the seats out of the streetcar to get him to Batavia. So he brought this limo in here, and he apparently sent a letter to the Methodist church minister and said he wanted to come and see the church and he'd be there on this date at this time. Well, apparently, I guess they were greatly regretting it, the Methodists never got the letter. So he gets to Batavia, and the Methodist church is all locked up. So then he comes down the street, and here's the Congregational and the Calvary Episcopal. Well, he was very interested in their designs too. So he walked around, and there was somebody at both churches, and they got him in. Well, then subsequent to this, somebody from the Methodist heard that he was there. They showed up, so he got into the Methodist before the day was over with. But as a result of that, he walked around Batavia, and John Gustafson was totally sure that someplace along the line, somebody must have taken a picture of him in Batavia, because this was the main thing, that he should be something that we should have in the history books, that the biggest man in the history of the world was in our town. Well, so John says to me, when I wrote the book, I didn't have anything to say about it, so I didn't get it in. So would you keep your eyes and ears open if we ever get any evidence that he really was here? Please put the date and the time, or year and whatever in the book. So I said, fine. Well, I'm here 40 years later, and I still haven't found out when Robert Watlow was in Batavia. But there seemed to be enough evidence in Gustafson's mind that he had been here. So go to the next slide. All right, so in the early 1980s, I have this kind of strange hobby that I'm a member of a group of guys, and we go around to all the cities in Illinois, and we've been to all of them. It took 40 years to do this, but we visit the fire stations in Illinois. So we've got a complete photographic record of all the fire stations in the state of Illinois. So we go down to Alton. We run a trip down to the St. Louis area. So we go in and talk to the chief, and the chief was a real nice guy. And when he heard what we wanted to do, he says, well, I'll put you in the car, or I'll get in the car and you follow me, and I'll take you. I have 5 stations, and I'll take you to all of them. And he says, I just hired myself a new secretary yesterday, and she doesn't know where any of the fire stations are, so I'm going to bring her in my car and show her where the other stations are. So, okay, so we start on this, and so near the end of the tour, I say to the fire chief, I've got this thing back in my town where we're trying to find out about Robert Watlow. He says, I was a little kid when he was still alive, but I remember him, blah, blah, blah. And he says, well, let me take you to a statue. We've erected a full-size, to-the-inch statue of Robert Watlow in downtown Alton, Illinois. So we go there, and the chief secretary is standing there, so I say to her, would you stand next to this to give me people to look at my photograph, or a context of what how big this gentleman really was. So she gladly did it, and then the chief says to me, gee, could you send her a copy of that picture? So I did that. So anyway, we had this picture taken of Mr. Watlow, and you can see how tall he was. I mean, he was really, most doors he had to bend over to try to get into. And there's been several large articles written about him, but supposedly at one point in time, the fire chief told us, well, Hollywood's been in here and researched this, and they may want to, they're talking about making a movie about him. Well, I've never seen the movie, but I mean, he was a very, very, very different type of individual to have on the face of the earth given his size. So that one's still kind of laying out there, but I just wanted to share that story with you that John Gustafson was really intense on trying to find the day that Watlow visited Batavia and walked around to the churches up here and stood on the front lawns. So supposedly as part of his Batavia, he would give little sermons practicing to be a minister. So when he got down in the Congregational Church, I guess that was the last one he visited, the Methodists had brought him into their building, and then the Episcopals had people. So he had about 10, 15 people here, so they brought him down and they all sat right across the street here on the grass in front of the Congregational Church. And Watlow got up on the steps there and gave a short sermon about God and his beliefs and how people thought he was different and strange, but he was just a product of God, and God wanted to know there could be people this big in the world. And he really had a very strong religious message. And unfortunately, I guess they were the determination that his parts of his body just wore out given the size and the weight and the multitudes of things that were pulling on it. So one day he got sick and fainted, and they took him to the hospital, and he was pronounced dead. So he only lived to be 22 years of age. But he's kind of hidden away in the Batavia background there because John Gustafson was sure that somebody must have taken a picture. And he was hoping that whoever took the picture put it in some box someplace, and when someday when they were cleaning out their files or whatever have you, they would find this picture and the picture would show up. Well, it hasn't yet, but if anybody knows anybody that's got a picture of a giant guy in Batavia, we'd like to have it. And I would suggest that the next history book that's written about Batavia, we would try to put that story in about Watlow being here and his whole thing with what is going on. Then John Gustafson had a couple of other dates that he wanted. What he wanted me to do was keep his book in total the way it was, but then if there were things that he forgot to put in that myself or whoever succeeded me would write in as just kind of an aside into the history. Back 50 years ago on this date, this happened. And two other events that he was, wanted in the book that weren't in the book was the visit by Dwight D. Eisenhower to Batavia in 1919 on June 21st, and then the visit on October 25th, 1960 by John F. Kennedy. And interestingly, both of those gentlemen came, obviously many years apart, but when Eisenhower came, he came here as part of a military convoy that was assigned by then President Woodrow Wilson, and Eisenhower was an Army captain at this point in time, and he was part of a convoy of 79 vehicles and 295 soldiers that was to go from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco and try to figure out the route of a transcontinental highway across the United States of America. And so the day that Eisenhower came to Batavia, the convoy had stayed the night before down in Chicago Heights. And if you were part of this convoy, one of the things that I guess the guys did was they'd set up a temporary camp, and then they had big searchlights as part of their convoy, and they'd turn those on after dark and do a light show for the people in the city that they were going through. And so as a result of that, many people, women in the town would bake cookies and bread and stuff. So these guys were well fed throughout the United States because they were putting on this show for these people. So when Eisenhower got to Batavia, a strange thing happened. They stopped the convoy down in front of Mooseheart, which was brand new and just opened, to show. They brought all the kids out to Route 31 so they could see this thing. And then they started up the hill. Now the hill that's down there now, once you leave Mooseheart and go north, the hill was much, much steeper then than it is now. IDOT, State Highway Authority, has done stuff on that road several times to get it evened out so people can easier drive up. So at this point in time, that hadn't been done. So they take these 79 military vehicles and they try to go up this hill, and all the military vehicles started to overheat because all the water was shifting in them by the depth and the pitches on the hill. So they got up to the top of the hill there by the Moose Lodge, and as they described it, it was like we were in a cloud. I mean, there was so much steam from all these vehicles and they were all overheating. So what they needed was water. So the city had some knowledge they were coming, and so the public works director, whose name was Allie Perry, went down and told them, well, get in the vehicles and drive them slowly and come up to our brand new high school, which was right here. And right out front of here, there was a horse drinking trough that was on the city water system. So it always had a lot of water in it. So the public works director says, you get there, I'll turn the thing on full bore. I can give you as much water as you want. So Eisenhower and another Army person, later was in World War II, with him, they were the captains, and so supposedly they stood out here in the middle of Batavia Avenue and Wilson and directed the traffic for all this stuff for almost 2 hours. Eisenhower stood outside here. So then in October 25th of '60, Kennedy came through on a campaign swing for his presidency. He came from the north down to the south, and when they finally got here, he stopped and got up on the, many of you maybe were there, got up in the back of the car and gave a campaign speech, which was 1 minute and 43 seconds. We have a copy of the speech, so I can tell you how long it was. And then he got in the car, back in the car, because it started to rain, and so they said to Kennedy, we got to get you out of here and get the convertible top up. So they drove him down into the next block and stopped in front of Johnson's drugstore. And they stopped in front of Bert Johnson's drugstore. Kennedy supposedly gets out of the car to brush himself off. Bert Johnson comes out the door and says to John F. Kennedy, hey, do you remember me? And Kennedy looked at him and he says, boy, you are familiar. And Johnson says, well, I was the navigator on the PT boat in the Solomon Islands in August of 1943 that rescued you. And when we got you in the boat, it was nighttime and we had to sit in the base of the boat. I was the navigator, so you came down and sat with me, and we talked for about 5 hours that night. And so they all seem to remember that, both of them remembered it. They subsequently sent each other a letter about it and everything else, which I believe the Historical Society has copies of it. So that's just kind of a sidebar story. So this past few months, we've gotten a grant from the Dunham Foundation in Aurora to do a historic sign program in downtown Batavia. And they gave us $75,000. So we're able to buy, we've already ordered up some very, very nice signs that we're going to be mounting, and I think we're going to do a few at a time, but a couple of the first ones is we're going to have, right outside here, we're going to have the story of John F. Kennedy and Dwight D. Eisenhower stopping at this location 40 years apart. Eisenhower was the one that created the U.S. space program, and Kennedy was the one that challenged the space program to put the man on the moon before the end of the decade of the 1960s. So it's very interesting to have those two guys who did what they did come together in Batavia locations within 40 years, but they were standing almost at the same locations when they stopped here. So we've kind of got that going. Then this thing with the moon in Batavia goes a little bit further. The city council chambers down on Island Avenue was a company for many years by the name of, after the Appleton Windmill Company left, there was another company moved in by the name of Dunbar Capital, and many of you may remember that. Dunbar Capital had a division within themselves called DK Aerospace, and they made some of the early components for the U.S. space program in its early days. And one of the things that got made in what today is our city council chambers was the flexible fuel lines that were used in the rocket that landed on the moon in 1969. And when the astronauts went off to the moon and came back, they wrote a book, which I think is probably available in the library here, called First on the Moon. And in that book, it's very clear that they name all the small towns in America that made contributing components to the space program, and they say Batavia, Illinois, for this flexible fuel lines. So then beyond that, right across the street here at the Methodist Church, we find out that between 1915 and 1918, there was a minister there named Reverend Fay Arnold Moon. His last name was Moon. And Reverend Fay Arnold Moon left the Methodist Church in 1918 to become a chaplain in the Army in World War I. But while Reverend Moon was here, he had a daughter that went to school here in this building, the building that was later tore down before we built the library. And her name was Marion. And Marion Moon ends up being the mother of Buzz Aldrin, who landed on the moon and put the flag on the moon. So we got plenty to brag about in Batavia as it revolves around the moon landing. And so that's kind of my first story that I want to talk about. Then let's go to the next slide here. Okay, the next one I want to talk about is Fermilab. Now Fermilab has I can't say enough about how proud I am to have them in Batavia, and they are very nice people out there. But they're doing things that they try to keep somewhat quiet because the rest of the world would like to get in there and find out what really is going on in there. Now they've just gotten funded for their second new accelerator, which is under construction, and it's going to be spinning here, and we're going to fire it up to a mine in South Dakota where it will be received, and they're going to be able so they explained to me that by moving this little route that this thing, it's all just fired away underground, that they're going to be able to run all these neutrons through every known earthly surface, whether it's rock or gravel or dirt or water or whatever. They're going to see if any of them have any resistance or what the impacts are. So anyway, that's a couple years away. When they get this thing built, which is going to be just on the east side of the new Batavia Commons subdivision out at Wind Energy and Kirk, they're going to have about 2,000 more people working out there. But the more interesting thing about Fermilab, and this has been a bit of a challenge for us at the city. About 3 years ago, the International Electrical Engineers called up one day and asked me, would you come to Fermilab on this date, it was shortly before Christmas, and participate in a ceremony we're going to have because they've agreed to allow us to do this. And so I said, okay, well, what are we doing? They said, we're going to present them with a plaque that's going to be on their front door out there. So they didn't tell me any more about it than that, so I get out there, and here's this beautiful plaque, and it says, presented by the International Electrical Engineers to Fermi National Accelerator in Batavia, Illinois, in appreciation of the fact that at this location was created the technology that allowed for the creation of the MRI medical research machine. And that if you think about the MRI medical research machine and all the probably now millions of people that have been impacted positively by it, all the blocks in your body and everything else that they've been able to see, to think that that came out of Fermilab is something to be very, very proud of. So this news gets out, and I just probably shouldn't tell you this story, but you're all good people. This comes out about putting this plaque up, and if you can get into Fermilab today, and it's not easy to do it, right by the front door is this plaque hanging there from the International Electrical Engineers about the MRI machine. So anyway, all of a sudden, Homeland Security is calling my IT staff, technology staff down at the city, and they said, we got a problem going here and we need to get you guys included in it. So the staff says, well, what's going on? And they said, we got all these attacks from all over the world coming in on the Fermilab computer system because they're all trying to crash into it and find out what Fermilab is working on next after they invented this MRI machine. And so they're coming at you from all kinds of directions. So Fermilab has erected this huge technological firewall that's totally around it, so anybody that tries to get in, they crash into the wall, and then it goes to some place where Homeland Security is sitting there looking to see whose address and signal this is and whatever have you. And so they know, I guess they're not going to get in, but they know who's trying to get in. So they said, now we've noticed a new thing that's happening. They crash into the firewall and they can't get any farther. So what we now do is that they say, well, where is this place? Well, it's in Batavia, Illinois. So let's go to the city of Batavia's computer system. So they come in and they come into your system, and they since have had us put some stuff on our wall or our system that goes to the same place that the Fermilab stuff goes. And they crash into that. Well, that don't go any place. So then they say, well, who's the mayor in this place? So here I am. So they say, well, okay, let's go after his website. So they come in, and I've got some silly passwords, but one of the passwords I was using, and they finally called and said, you've been hacked 16 times by these people getting your password, and after they hacked me, if they read my computer site, there's not a lot on there that's going to be of any interest to any of them. So, but they said, we think we need to get the mayor a password that they can't crash. So I now have a password on my city computer that doesn't go, it goes to the Homeland Security too. So anyway, that's my story with Fermilab, because they're doing such nice, wondrous things out there that people all over the world, all of our enemies, and they say, yeah, a lot of them's coming out of the Middle East and China and Russia, and everybody else is trying to get in to see what Fermilab's going to do next. So, I mean, I think that's something we should be kind of proud of, because, I mean, it's not like they're out there making weapons and blow the world up. They're making the MRI machine. That really was a very, very positive step for mankind. So that should be in the history book when we write. I can't write the next edition, but I know the Historical Society is kind of trying to find somebody that do it, and that certainly will be one thing I'm going to share with them that they need to get in the book, that the MRI was made there. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, this is a picture of Senator Everett McKinley Dirksen. Now, one of the great questions about Fermilab that remains not been answered is, in 1966, it was announced on December 16th of that year that was where the U.S. Department of what would we call them? Anyway, that was where we were going to build Fermilab. The date was December 16th, 1966. And it was announced by Lyndon Johnson at the White House. And so there's a lot of political science students that study politics, and I think right now there's probably more than ever. But this thing about Batavia, and this is why I want to share this with you, rises its ugly head, is there was a strange thing that happened about Fermilab's announcement. And nobody has ever come forth and answered what happened or why it was done this way, but Lyndon Johnson had a press conference and he just said something, well, we've talked to the U.S. Department of Energy, I guess who it was, and they want to build this, they called it an atom smasher. And they want to build this atom smasher, and I've decided we're going to build it in Batavia, Illinois. Okay, fine. So, but then somebody says, now, wait a minute, politically, what's going on here? There was an election in November of '66 of that year, and it was for the U.S. Senate. And it was the then three-term Illinois Senator, Democrat by the name of Paul Douglas, ran against Charles Percy. And Percy beat him after 3 terms in office. So I've had some kids from the University of Chicago political science graduate. They have at the University of Chicago, they have a graduate school in there called the Harris School of Public Policy, and it's paid for by the family of the gentleman who invented the permanent. And they've donated millions of dollars to this school to get it going. And you have to be a college graduate from one of their very prestigious universities, but if you want to study politics further, you try to get into this one. And I get to talk to these kids with some regularity because of some other stuff I'm involved with in Chicago, and they know I'm the old man in the room, but I'm also from Batavia, which is where Fermilab is. And so they tell me that one of the great unanswered questions in American politics is, why in 1966 did not Lyndon Johnson announce the Fermilab was coming to Batavia, Illinois, before the senatorial election, of which time then Paul Douglas could have taken, you know, the credit and the prestige of it all coming. But they waited 40 days later, after the election was over with, to make the announcement. So, you know, I've been asked this question a number of times. So I've become over the years a pretty good friend of Richard M. Daley, the son. And so one time I flew with him to a meeting out in Los Angeles, so we sat on a plane together for 3.5 hours, had a lot of time to talk. So I raised this question with him about, what are we doing? Why do you think that they waited to announce? And Daley's answer was Everett Dirksen. And he says, you have to appreciate that Everett Dirksen was one of the most respected and popular U.S. senators that ever was, and he had as many friends in the Democratic Party as he did in the Republican. And if Dirksen wanted something, Dirksen could probably get it. And he says, if you look at what happened, Kennedy's assassinated in November of '63, and there was a couple things that wanted to be done to honor Kennedy. One was the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and another one was the War on Poverty, and then there was another one about providing federal money for lower income people to buy a house or get into a house. And he says on all three of those passed the Congress and passed the Senate only because Everett Dirksen, who was then minority leader of the Senate, walked in and said, well, I want to get a bunch of people on these bills and let's get this approved. So he says, I think what happened was Fermilab's laying out there and they're going to build it someplace, and Everett Dirksen walked into the White House and says to Lyndon Johnson, I want that atom smasher for Illinois. And so this is what these kids in Chicago now who are looking at everybody's connections and how this, I think they're pretty well convinced that that's what really did happen. So as Daley says to me after he gets done with that, he says, well, he says, you know, Dirksen had some magic in his bones, because if you come, you know, he was a Republican leader of the Senate, but if you come to Chicago, which was heavily Democratic, and he says, my dad, you know, he did a lot of stuff, and I think he did a lot of stuff too, yeah. But he says, if you come into downtown Chicago and you look for the largest federal building that's down there, what's it named? It's named for Everett Dirksen. So that's kind of another kind of spin on Batavia. I would tell you that I'm sure this whole Fermilab thing is not going away. Some of these people keep thinking that there's more to this story than we really know. You know, I recently participated in a goodbye ceremony for the gentleman who was leaving Fermilab as the executive director. And so they asked myself and the mayor of Warrenville, who are the two immediate neighbors, to be speakers at this little get-together. And so I got up and I told this story about, you know, how we think that Fermilab got chosen for the location. And the director says, get the historian in here. We got to get the mayor on camera here that we got this story down. Because he says, I don't know if we've ever really had anybody tell us this. It's a very interesting question, but it's one that is just kind of laying around out there. And so Anyway, in the meantime, one day, I'm out on this fire buffing thing that I do to visit all these fire departments, and we go down to Pekin, Illinois. And we go into Pekin, and we're taking the pictures of the fire trucks, and the Pekin guys say, hey, down the street here, we got the Dirksen Memorial. So I get in the car, and we drive down to Pekin to the Dixon Memorial, and here it is. And what's very interesting about the Dixon Memorial, if you look closely, standing atop of both of his feet is an elephant and then a donkey. So I don't know what you think of Dirksen. A lot of people, get politically, aligned with one party or another, and they don't like somebody because they're from the other party. But, it certainly appears that Dirksen had the power and the prestige in the U.S. Congress to do some stuff that really, at the end of the day, for Batavia specifically, was very beneficial. And I say that because on December 16, 1966, when it got announced, that was probably one of the most significant days of history in Batavia, because imagine today what it would have been like if you went out to where Fermilab is, what would be there today. I would suggest it would just be one mass of urbanization. We'd have the second Batavia High School over on the east side someplace. We would kind of be probably Naperville too. And there's 6,800 acres out there, so most of which was in Batavia's controls. And that would have been, really quite a thing to done something different with. So I just think that having that there, and now what they've done and what they've done to improve the world is something that's very, very popular. So let's go to my last story. Now, many of you may remember this magazine when you were kids. This has been around for a long time. And this is the June 1955 edition of Jack and Jill magazine. And I think maybe I've given George or Stacy a copy of this magazine, so they may have it in the library. I know you can go on the City of Batavia website, and we have what's in this magazine online, because to this day we still get people calling up about it. So what happened here was, so I'm told, there was about a subscription on this magazine nationwide in 1955 of probably around 75,000 people. And people would get it and then read it to their children and whatever, grandparents, and everybody. It was all nice stories to read to kids. And so in 1955, we had a lady that lived out on Deer Path Road whose name was Peg Tyndall Jackson. And any of you who went to Batavia High School, and I know there's a couple here in the room, in the early 1960s, her daughter was in Batavia High School and went to school here. So anyway, Mrs. Jackson was a writer, very professional writer, and she wrote 29 articles that were published in various magazines on a variety of subjects. But in this particular magazine, she went down to the Batavia Fire Station, and she asked the fire chief if she could write an article about the new Dalmatian fire dog that was then at the Batavia Fire Station. Let's go to the next slide. So she wrote a story called Sparky the Fire Dog. Now, she wrote this story, and basically what happened was, one day out of the blue, this Dalmatian dog appeared out of nowhere. Nobody ever came to claim it or anything else, and it started scratching on the doors of the Batavia Fire Station. So Bud Richter was the chief down there. So Richter lets the dog in, and the dog immediately kind of befriended. There was only one fireman on duty at the time with Richter. Richter worked Monday through Friday, but the fireman was a 24-hour shift. So they had this dog, and the three firemen, we had three at the time, one each day, they all agreed to let the dog stay. So they let the dog stay, and the dog used to disappear for a while and go off someplace, but he always came back. Well, then he got himself into jumping up on the fire truck, and when they were going to go out, he always liked to ride on this small hook and ladder we had because he could get behind it. And then as it went down the street with the siren blowing, you'd hear this dog barking like crazy that he was going to the fire. So then what would happen is the dog would get to the fire, any place in Batavia, he'd immediately jump off the fire truck and he'd leave the scene. And he'd go exploring the neighborhood. And so, lo and behold, I have this record. I don't bring it out and show it to anybody, but the city of Batavia has this little thing in the records from Rudd Clark, who was then the chief of police, and Bud Richter, who was the fire chief. And there was a big to-do because people were coming to the Batavia Police Department and wanting to file complaints about this dog impregnating their dog. When he jumped off the fire truck, he'd go over and their dog had to be leashed and tied up, and this dog would come in and Romeo, so that they started calling this dog Romeo. Because, so Rudd Clark sent the fire department, put it in writing, and I have a copy of this, and telling them that they're going to have, if you're going to put, the dog's name was not Sparky, it was Streamer. If you're going to put Streamer on the fire truck, you better have a leash on there so that when you get to the scene, the dog can jump off the truck, but he only can go about 20 feet and then he's stopped. And needless to say, the dog didn't like that. But anyway, Richter got mad at one point about this memo, so he put a memo out to the firemen saying, from this day forward, the Batavia Fire Department will no longer wash out the dog pound. And needless to say, then Mayor Anderson, I guess, had to get involved in it and get Richter and Clark together and say, guys, this is too small town here. So at the end of the day, Richter had to put the leash on the dog. But then people would bring their dog. If you had another Dalmatian, they've heard about this dog, so they'd bring that dog down and try to get impregnated by his. But then, so let's go to the next here. Okay. Well, let's go. Can you go back for a second? No, the other way. I want to go back there. When this story hit, there's a couple of you here who are former Batavia firemen, and I think you were all volunteers, but I don't know how many of you remember this. But there was a massive turnout at the Batavia Fire Department from people from other towns, Rockford, South Bend, Indiana, Indianapolis, all coming up, and what they wanted to do was have their kid's picture taken with this dog. And so, you know, Richter was Mr. Public Relations, and he really, in his tenure, he really did a lot of interesting things, some of which are still with us. He founded the 4th of July fireworks program with Harold Peterson, who was on the department as volunteer. He came up with the idea and told it to Richter, and Richter, I guess, just ran with it. So that was in 1950, and to this day, we're still having 4th of July fireworks, all paid for by donated money, even 72 years later. And Richter also came up with the idea that he would fix broken toys and then give them to the Batavia Rotary Club, and they would run around the night before Christmas and give these to needy families. Well, we're still kind of doing that. We're not fixing toys anymore, but out at the Sam's Club for the last 3 years, we've had the toy distribution in part of that building, and we have people, there's a few of you here in this room I know, give us thousands of dollars to buy toys for needy children at Christmas time. And then the Sunday before Christmas, I have to have the Batavia Police in uniform come out there and stand on the day we're distributing the toys, because to get the toys, we send you a letter that says you've been identified as somebody, you know, and what they do is a meeting between the school people, the police department, and the ministerial association, and they identify families they think are going through a rough time. And so then they send those families a letter saying, if you'd like to have some toys for Christmas, come on this time and this date, and we will give you toys. And it's great we've been able to do it, we're really good. But in the meantime, there's all these people from other places are now hearing that in Batavia, we got free toys that are all in the box and everything else. So let's go over to Batavia. So now I have to have, always has to be 2 men and 1 woman policeman standing there. And so when you pull up and get out, we say to you, can you show us your letter, which the letter we've sent you? But no, I just heard this is where you get, oh, I'm sorry, if you don't have the letter, you don't get the toys. So some of them get kind of mad about it and storm around and whatever have you, but goodness gracious, if we gave them to everybody that wanted to come in there, we'd be out of toys in a real hurry. So we're trying to take care of the Batavia people. So anyway, Richter had this story going. So Peg Tyndall Jackson comes down and writes this story. And in the story, she changes Streamer's name to Sparky. That was the first thing she did. And then she gets into how Sparky jumped on the fire truck one of the first nights he was there, and he went to a fire in West Chicago and immediately got off the truck and went off exploring. And the fire got put out, and Batavia had to leave Sparky in West Chicago because there was nobody there, couldn't find him. And then he comes running back, came back to Batavia by himself and got on the fire truck just as it was leaving to go to someplace else. Well, none of that happened, per se. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, this is a picture of Peg Tyndall Jackson. Now, I don't know who did this, but if you read the obituary here, it says in here, Peg lived on Deer Path Road in Batavia for 40 years, and many of her stories were locally inspired. The story of Sparky the Fire Dog, which appeared in Jack and Jill, was a quote-unquote almost true story of the former Batavia Fire Chief, Bud Richter. And it was almost true because she changed it also. Let's go to, what's the next one? Okay, this is a picture taken at the fire in West Chicago that she says the dog ran away from. Well, here's the dog, here's Chief Richter, and here's the dog standing right next to him. And Richter wouldn't let that dog go anyplace, so the dog came back, and so she just kind of changed the story a little bit. And let's see, what's the next one? This is a picture of the old Batavia Fire Station. You can see how crammed and jammed everything in this place was. And so all of a sudden, Bud Richter is faced with, on a Saturday or a Sunday, easily could be 15 to 20 different people showing up from goodness knows where. They had read the story in Jack and Jill magazine, and they just wanted their grandchild or whomever it was to have their picture taken with this dog. I mean, this became quite an interesting little thing. I mean, so then Richter had to go over to Pete and John's meat market over at River and Wilson, and he got the guys to give him some little piece of meat. So every time somebody came, the fireman could go get one of these pieces of meat and say to the dog, come now, we're going to have her picture taken, and they give the dog the meat so he'd be cooperative with it. Let's go to the next picture. So then it got into, because of the size of that building that you saw, nobody quite knew where to post the dog. And so Richter finally came up with, he got a professional photographer in, and he had this picture taken showing where streamers should be put when the people come, and so then you put the kids around him with the fire trucks in the background. And so this became the standard so there probably is several hundred pictures around the country of people with the dog sitting around this, you know, in front of the fire station. So this is an interesting story because I think it really tells, you know, kind of some of the really nice, unique things that happen in Batavia. And these aren't things that are happening in some other town, they're only happening here. And, you know, the fact that 72 years later, 73 years later now, we're still firing the fireworks off, and we're still giving away the toys, I think speaks well for what Batavia is all about. And it's always been done with little, if no controversy, and it's all, everybody's donating the money for the fireworks or donating the money for the toys. And so we bring out the best spirits of people when we do this. So I guess I'm going to show you the final slide. This one was taken in 1950. The dog was, article appeared in 55. This was taken in spring of 56. And the little kid standing there is yours truly. I was 5 years old when this picture was taken. And so Chief Richter was there, so he and I later became very good. In fact, I gave the eulogy at his funeral, but we became very good friends, and so I wanted him there with the dog. So that's so at the end of the day, everybody was coming in the fire station saying to Richter, "Where's Sparky?" And the dog's name wasn't Sparky, it was Streamer. So somebody came in one day and said to Richter, "Could I get you to let me use your dog to impregnate my dog?" And it was another Dalmatian. So Richter says, "Yeah, I will, but would you give me one of the puppies?" And so they said, "Yeah, we'll do that." So lo and behold, it worked very well. And so they show up at the fire station with this dog. And so right away, Richter named the dog Sparky. And so Sparky had a lot of his father's genes in him, I think, because I think it was less than 6 months, one day he walks away from the fire station, go out and find whatever he was looking for, and he gets up on East Wilson Street up there now near where Berkeley's is, and he runs out in front of a car and gets hit and killed. Aww. So we lost Sparky, and we had a Sparky for about 6 months, but he got himself into some problems and got killed by a car wreck. So that's kind of the end of my Batavia report for this year. If anybody's got any questions or comments, I'll be happy to take them. Yes, sir.
About Batavia and Fermilab. At the time, the Daily Journal ran full-page and double-page articles about Weston.
Right.
And the mayor of Weston, but I didn't hear you mention any of that. Can you set me straight, please?
Well, what happened there is that Weston had incorporated themselves as a city. But then when Fermilab came in, Fermilab bought the entire village of Weston, and a couple of them, they had to condemn the houses because people didn't want to sell them, but they sold them all. And when it was announced that they were going to do this, I believe that a couple articles I've seen, it's Batavia, Illinois, because Weston was about to disappear. So Weston, some of that is still out on Fermilab property, and the houses are all used as individual offices. But Batavia was the one that got the mailing address. It's Fermilab, Batavia, Illinois. So I don't know who we had in power around here that knew Dirksen or Percy or whomever was making these, or because you had to go over on the Democratic Party to get Lyndon Johnson to, and he probably could have cared less, but at the end of the day, Batavia was the one that got all the name for it, and so we're now the place where the foreign countries all want to hack onto us and find out what we got, because we're at Fermilab, and they think that somehow, because I'm the mayor of the city's the city, we have a direct line that goes past the Fermilab firewall. We don't. So, but pardon?
Before becoming the name of Fermilab, we called it Weston.
Well, they called it the NAL and the Atom Smasher. Yeah, the Weston thing was there, but you know, the DuPage County apparently didn't want that around either as a name, because it was no longer an incorporated city, because the minute Fermilab bought all the property, they unincorporated that whole thing. So it wasn't, it's a good point, thanks for bringing that up, but that's what basically happened there. It would be nice if someday somebody should write a history of kind of what all happened around the area and did that. There was a lot of family farms that were out there that were 3 or 4 generations that all got taken by Fermilab. At the end of the day, given what they've done out there and how they do it, I've been quoted in the Chicago news media as saying, well, Fermilab's a great neighbor, doesn't smoke, smell, pollute, turn on bright lights, or make noise. And they don't. And I mean, they all kind of work different hours, so very seldom do you ever go out there and see a big backup of cars trying either to get in or get out. And so, you know, it's the ideal neighbor of what you want to have. And as I say, had that not been built there, we would have one mishmash of density and urbanization out there today.
Well, unfortunately, the Daily Journal is out of business, and I don't know whether, I mean, it was more than 100-year-old newspaper.
Right.
And I have no idea whether it's been archived anywhere.
Yeah.
as far as you wanted to know if someone could write a story.
George?
As far as the family farms, the Fermilab actually has published a book about all
Right.
the farms in that area. We have a copy of that.
Right. So Fermilab has been very supportive of trying to do stuff. Somebody back here? I saw a hand go up. Yes.
Does Fermilab pay taxes to the city?
Pardon?
Does Fermilab pay taxes
No.
to the city?
No.
Because
They don't pay taxes. They're a government agency. They're totally exempt. They have, the only thing, they have their own security system. They have their own fire department. Now, when it was just where she brought up Weston, Weston's western boundary was the Batavia Fire District boundary. So part of Weston was in the Batavia Fire District, but all that got taken down, and then when they came in, Fermilab announced they were going to have their own fire department, which they put into service, and it's been there ever since. And the only thing that they don't have is they don't have a paramedic ambulance. So they now contract with the Tri-Cities, Batavia, Geneva, and St. Charles, who run our ambulance, and if there's somebody there having a real bad health issue, we dispatch an ambulance to
what
them.
about water?
Waters, they got their own wells, own everything, and so we don't, we ran some water line out there, but they got to be too big, and so they got their own sewer system and the whole 9 yards. They do part of the western edge of the site, I think, still comes into the Batavia sewer plant, but most of it, I think they're on their own out there now too. So, I mean, they've been very cooperative. Of course, you got the federal government behind you, you got enough money to do whatever it is you want to do. And especially when you're doing the neat things that they, like this MRI machine, man, they've gotten miles and miles of positive PR off of that one. Yes?
Back in 2010 or 2011, I don't remember which, when I was interviewing people at Bumpsy, the Methodist Church, to write the history that I wrote in 2011. I was interviewing the older people especially, of course, and one of the very elderly women, as part of her interview, did tell the story of what she remembered of Waddle. She didn't know his name. She just said, a tall fella came to town one time.
Right.
And she said it was in the late 30s.
Yeah, that's what it was.
And that he came on a nice spring day, she said. And she talked about people seeing him outside. And she wasn't there at the time. She just told what she remembered having happened. She's long gone now.
But the story that Gustafson had was he came to Batavia specifically because he heard of the architecture of the Methodist Church.
Beeman is the architect.
Yeah, whatever.
Saul Beeman. Yeah.
Right, and so then when that came to be, he got here and they hadn't gotten his letter or whatever have you, he walked down and went to the congregational.
Yeah.
In the meantime, somebody over there obviously knew somebody over at the Methodist, and they got some folks on the phone and they got him in there, and so he got to see everything he wanted to see, but it was...
I didn't include it in the book because I couldn't document.
Right.
I couldn't.
But she had all the dates kind of right, the late 30s,
Yeah.
and this big guy.
Yeah.
And, I don't know if, he now, Guinness Book of World Records identifies him as the largest known human being ever to be on the face of the earth. And that's quite an honor to have, I guess. I don't think I'd like to have been it. Well, it's after 1 o'clock. I guess I'm supposed to be done here, so I want to thank you all for turning out for this. The library staff tells me this is one of the bigger crowds they've had for this in a long time. I hope you found my information this year somewhat valuable. Thank you.